The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, when the leaves outside my apartment window had just started turning that particular shade of amber that always made me feel something I couldn't quite name. I was standing in my kitchen, pouring my second cup of coffee, already mentally running through my schedule for the day, client meetings, invoices, a call with my accountant, when my phone buzzed against the counter. I didn't recognize the number, a 614 area code, Columbus, Ohio, the city I hadn't set foot in for 5 years. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Is this Mara Calloway? The voice on the other end was professional, measured, a woman. This is St. Michael's Medical Center. We're calling regarding a patient, a Jade Calloway. She listed you as her emergency contact. I set my coffee cup down so slowly it didn't make a sound. Jade, my sister, the person who had stood in our parents' living room 7 years ago and told a lie so devastating, so perfectly calibrated to destroy me that I had packed 2 bags and driven away from the only home I'd ever known without looking back. She had listed me as her emergency contact. After everything she did, after 5 years of silence so complete it sometimes felt like I had imagined having a family at all, she had written down my name. I pressed the phone against my ear and said, "What happened?" And that question, those 2 small words, cracked open something I thought I had sealed shut a long, long time ago. Welcome to Big Sky Storytime. I hope you will like this story. Before listening to the story, I request you that if you have not subscribed to my channel, please subscribe to my channel and make the video a worthy one. Let's go to the story. Let me take you back. Not to the lie, not yet, because to understand what that lie cost me, you need to understand what I had before it. I grew up in Westerville, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus that looked exactly like every other suburb of Columbus. Wide streets lined with oak trees, 2-car garages, neighbors who waved from their driveways and brought casseroles when someone's grandmother passed. My parents, Tom and Linda Calloway, had built what looked from the outside like a picture-perfect life. My dad worked in insurance. My mom taught 2nd grade for 22 years. We had a golden retriever named Biscuit and a trampoline in the backyard that my sister and I spent entire summers on, screaming at the sky. I was the older daughter, 26 when everything fell apart, so you can do the math backward from there. I was the kind of kid who color-coded her notes and took the SAT twice because the first score was good but not good enough. I got a partial scholarship to Ohio State, worked 20 hours a week at a coffee shop on High Street to cover the rest, and graduated with a degree in business management and exactly $4,000 in debt, which felt like a miracle. By the time I was 24, I had started a small bookkeeping and financial consulting business out of my apartment. Nothing glamorous. I drove a 6-year-old Honda Civic, I made my own lunches, but I was building something real, something mine, and I was proud of it in the quiet way that people who have worked hard for every single thing they own tend to be proud of. Jade was 4 years younger than me. She was the one strangers noticed when we walked into a room together. Dark hair where mine was light, easy charm where I had to work for every social interaction, a laugh that made people lean toward her like sunflowers tilting toward light. My parents had her later, unexpectedly, and I think that surprise softened something in them that had been firmer with me. They didn't give her everything, we weren't wealthy, but they gave her the benefit of every doubt, every single one. I don't want to paint her as a villain from the beginning because she wasn't, not entirely. When she was 12 and I was 16, she used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and tell me stories about made-up countries. When I left for college, she cried so hard at drop-off that my dad had to take her for ice cream. There was a version of my relationship with Jade that was tender and real, and I have to hold on to that even now, even after everything, because if I don't, the whole story becomes too simple, and it was never simple. But there was always something underneath the tenderness, a current I couldn't quite name when we were kids, a restlessness in Jade that expressed itself as competitiveness, as this low-grade need to be witnessed that sometimes slipped into a need to be the only one witnessed. When I won a Whiting Award in high school, she spent the entire celebratory dinner talking about her volleyball tryouts. When I got my scholarship, she announced the same week that she was thinking about applying to art school in New York. Nothing was ever quite enough to hold her attention if it was also holding someone else's. My parents never saw it. Or maybe they saw it and chose not to name it, the way you sometimes love people around their edges rather than straight through them. I saw it. I filed it away. I loved her anyway. That was probably my first mistake.
The lie happened on a Saturday in April, 7 years ago, at my cousin Renee's engagement party. The whole family had come together at my aunt's house in Worthington. Cousins, aunts, uncles, my parents, Jade and her boyfriend at the time, a guy named Derek who sold software and wore boat shoes indoors. I had driven up from Columbus feeling good. My business had just landed its third real client. I was wearing a blue dress I'd bought on sale and felt confident in, and I remember thinking, walking into that party, that life was starting to feel like something I had actually chosen, rather than something that was happening to me. What I didn't know was that earlier that week, Jade had borrowed $500 from our parents without telling them it was for Derek's credit card debt. She'd told them it was for a veterinary emergency, the cat they didn't have, and she'd forged a signature on a check from our dad's business account, his small side business, the one he'd been running out of the garage for years, to cover the rest. I didn't know any of that. What I knew was that halfway through the party, my dad pulled me into the kitchen with a look on his face I had never seen before. It was the look of a man who had already decided something and was only going through the motions of telling you. My mom was already there, standing by the refrigerator, her arms crossed over her chest. Jade was leaning against the counter behind them, and even in that moment, even before a single word was spoken, something in her expression, some careful arrangement of distress, made the air in my chest go tight. "Mara," my dad said, "we need to talk about the money." I didn't know what money he meant. I told him so. "The check," he said, "from my business account. $1,200, Mara. We found it this morning." I stared at him. "I don't know what you're talking about. Your signature is on it." "Dad," I said it slowly, like each word needed its own space. "I did not write a check from your account. I don't even have access to your account." My mother's jaw tightened. "You did when you were helping us with the taxes last fall. You had our login information for 2 weeks." And there it was. 2 months prior, I had helped my parents organize their financial documents for tax season. I'd been their unofficial bookkeeper since I started my business, the responsible daughter who knew about these things. They had given me temporary access to their accounts to pull statements. I felt the ground shift under my feet. "Mom," I looked past my parents at Jade, who was staring at her hands. "Jade, someone tell me what's happening." Jade looked up, and I will never, for the rest of my life, forget what I saw on her face in that moment. It was not guilt. It was something more complicated than guilt. It was fear, yes, but wrapped around it was something that looked almost like relief, like she had been holding something very heavy and had just set it down in the center of the room between us. "I saw you go into Dad's office," she said. Her voice was quiet, designed to sound reluctant. "A few weeks ago, when you came to visit, you were at his desk for a while. I was looking for a pen." "Mara," my mom said my name like it was a door she was closing. "We're not here to argue about this. We need you to explain where that money went." I didn't take any money. My voice was steady. I was proud of how steady it was, even while my hands had started to shake at my sides. "I did not forge a check. I have never stolen from you. I would never steal from you. Why would I steal from you? I have a business. I have income. I don't need—" "Then explain the signature," my dad said. "I can't explain it because I didn't write it." The silence in that kitchen was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I could hear the party continuing in the other room, my cousin Renee laughing at something, the distant pop of a champagne cork. Normal life moving forward 12 feet away, while mine was coming apart at the seams. "I want you to look at me," I said. I was talking to both my parents, but I was looking at Jade. "I want you to look at me and tell me you actually believe I did this." My mom looked at the floor. My dad said, "We just need some time, Mara. We need you to give us some space to figure this out." "Give you space." I repeated it softly, trying to understand the shape of the words. "You're asking me to leave. We're asking you to go home tonight and let us—" No. Something shifted in me. I felt it move, clean and final, like a key turning in a lock. I drove home that night with both hands tight on the steering wheel. Not crying, not yet. The tears came later, alone in my apartment at 2 a.m, sitting on the bathroom floor with my back against the tub, crying the way you cry when something truly fundamental has been taken from you. Not sobbing, just a slow, steady leaking like water through a crack in a wall. I kept waiting for the phone to ring, for my dad to call and say, "We looked into it, we're sorry, we believe you," for Jade to break down and tell them the truth. The phone didn't ring for 5 years.
I'm not going to tell you the next 5 years were easy, because they weren't. And I think you'd know I was lying if I did. The first year was the hardest. I lost 2 clients, family friends who had clearly heard a version of the story that cast me as a thief. I had to rebuild from scratch in a professional sense, while simultaneously trying not to come apart in a personal one. I moved from my 2-bedroom apartment into a smaller 1-bedroom on the other side of the city, the kind with thin walls and a radiator that clanked all night. I worked 60-hour weeks. I took on clients I would have turned down before. Any work that paid, any project that kept my mind occupied and my business alive. I had a therapist named Dr. Susan Park, whom I started seeing 6 months after the family collapse, and she is the reason I am standing here today with any degree of equanimity. She used a phrase once that I wrote in a notebook and kept on my desk for 3 years. The opposite of belonging is not rejection, it's inauthenticity. You were asked to be dishonest about who you are to be welcome at that table, and you chose yourself instead. I cried for 40 minutes after that session, sitting in my car in the parking garage, and then I drove home and cooked myself a real dinner for the first time in weeks. I made new family, a best friend named Camille, who I'd known since college, who showed up at my door the night I told her what happened with a bottle of wine and zero judgment. A mentor through a local women's business network, a woman named Gloria who had built her accounting firm from nothing and who believed in my work before I had fully learned to believe in it myself. A community of people who knew me only as who I had become, with no prior version to compare me to. By year 3, my business was stable. By year 4, it was growing. By year 5, I had 7 regular clients, 2 part-time contractors working under me, and an office. A real office, with my name on the door, in a building that smelled like fresh paint and possibility. I thought about my family. I won't pretend I didn't. Not every day, but the way you think about a sound you can't quite place, at odd moments, unexpectedly, when something would happen that I wanted to share with my mother and remembered I couldn't. On Thanksgiving, I cooked for Camille and her roommates and laughed until my stomach hurt, and somewhere in the middle of it, I thought about the way my dad used to tell the same 3 stories every single Thanksgiving dinner, and everyone would groan and secretly love it. And I held that thought quietly for a moment before letting it go. I had stopped waiting for the apology. That was the real turning point. Not when I stopped missing them, but when I stopped organizing my emotional life around the possibility that they might one day arrive at my door and make it right. The waiting had been its own kind of cage. Letting go of it felt like setting down something very heavy that I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying. I was lighter. I was ready. And then my phone rang on a Tuesday in October. I arrived at St. Michael's Medical Center at noon. The drive from my apartment was 40 minutes, and I spent most of it in silence, which is unusual for me. I'm a podcast person, an audiobook person, a "someone please talk to me so I don't have to sit with my own thoughts" person. But that day, I needed the quiet. I needed to hear myself think. The nurse at the front desk told me Jade was in the cardiac care unit. She had experienced a sudden cardiac event. The nurse said it carefully, clinically, 2 days prior. She was stable now, but it had been serious. There had been, apparently, a period of several hours when it had not been clear that she would be stable. I rode the elevator to the fourth floor and walked down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air and felt my heart doing something complicated in my chest. My parents were sitting in the waiting area outside Jade's room. I saw them before they saw me, and I had a single unguarded moment to take them in. My dad had gotten older. His hair, which had been salt and pepper when I left, was fully white now. He looked smaller somehow, like the years had compressed him slightly. My mom was holding a paper coffee cup in both hands and staring at the middle distance, and for a moment she looked so much like someone's grandmother that it startled me. Then she looked up and saw me. She made a sound I cannot fully describe, something between a breath and a word, a single exhalation of some feeling that had been waiting too long to be released. My dad stood, his mouth opened and closed once. I walked toward them, because what else do? You walk toward the thing even when your every cell in your body is braced for impact. "Mara," my mom said. She stood and took one step toward me and stopped, like she was waiting for permission. Her eyes were red. She had been crying for what looked like days. "I didn't know if you'd—" She stopped, started again. "Thank you for coming." "How is she?" I asked. My voice was professional, not cold but measured. I needed the measurement. "Stable," my dad said. "They're saying she'll need surgery, a procedure for her heart." He swallowed hard. "She's been asking for you." I nodded slowly. "Can I see her?"
She was smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing I noticed, stepping into that room. How small Jade looked in the hospital bed, with monitors attached to her chest and an IV in her arm, and that terrible institutional pallor that everyone gets under fluorescent lighting. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders. She'd been beautiful her whole life in that careless way that some people manage without effort, and even now, even like this, there was something striking about her face. But there were circles under her eyes I didn't recognize, and lines at the corners of her mouth that hadn't been there 7 years ago, and she looked like someone who had been tired for a long time. She turned her head when I came in and looked at me for a long moment without speaking. "Hi," I finally said. "Hi." Her voice was rough. She cleared her throat. "You actually came. You listed me as your emergency contact." "I know." A pause. "I wasn't sure if you'd still have the same number." "I do." She turned her face toward the window. Outside, the Ohio sky was doing that particular flat gray thing it does in October, like it can't quite commit to anything. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "I almost had them list someone else, but I kept thinking—" She stopped. Her jaw worked. "I kept thinking that if something happened, if this was—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Nothing happened," I said quietly. "You're stable." She nodded. Her hands were folded on top of the blanket, and I noticed they were shaking slightly. "Mara," her voice cracked on my name. "I need to tell you something." "Jade." "Please." She looked at me then fully, and the expression on her face was one I had never seen from her before, stripped clean of every performance, every careful arrangement, just raw, exhausted honesty. "I've been needing to tell you for 5 years, and I kept not doing it because I didn't know how. I told myself you'd moved on. I told myself it was better this way. But then I was lying in the ER 2 days ago, and they were asking me who to call, and I couldn't think of a single person I trusted the way I used to trust you." I sat down in the chair beside her bed. I didn't speak. "Jade, I forged the check. I forged your signature. I took the money because Derek had gambling debt I didn't know about, and I was trying to help him, and I panicked, and I just—" Her voice broke. "I just let everyone think it was you. I stood there and I let it happen. I didn't plan it exactly, but when it started going in that direction, I didn't stop it. I told them about you going to Dad's office, and I knew what they'd think, and I let them think it." The room was so quiet. "I know," I said. She stared at me. "You know?" "I figured it out eventually. The forged signature wasn't very close to mine. I saw a copy once through some of Dad's paperwork that got sent to me by accident years later, and Derek's financial history wasn't hard to piece together.
I didn't have proof that would have meant anything to them, but yes, I knew. Something moved across her face. Shame, I thought, but the real kind. Not the kind performed for sympathy, but the kind that sits deep in the chest and quietly corrodes everything around it. You never said anything. To whom? I asked. Not harshly, just a real question. To them? They'd already made their choice. They chose you without evidence, and they would have defended that choice without evidence. There was nothing to say. Jade pressed her lips together. A tear tracked silently down the side of her face. I didn't just hate you, it would have been easier. I thought about that for a moment, about Dr. Park's office and all the hours I'd spent working through exactly that question. Because hating you would have kept you at the center of my life, I said finally, and you'd already taken enough of it.
My parents came into the room a little while later, hesitantly, like they weren't sure they were allowed. My dad stopped in the doorway when he saw that Jade and I had been talking, some flicker of something crossing his face. Hope, maybe, the fragile, flinching kind. My mom sat on the other side of Jade's bed and took her hand, and then looked up at me with eyes that were asking something she didn't know how to say out loud. I told her, I said, preempting whatever careful construction she'd been building, about the check, about Derek. My dad closed the door behind him and stood with his back against it, like he needed the support. We found out, he said, his voice thick, about 2 years after you left. One of your uncle's friends worked at the bank. He recognized the account when something came up during an audit. We found the original. We saw... He stopped. We saw that the signature wasn't yours. I looked at him. 2 years? Mara. He said my name, and it contained something I hadn't heard from him since I was very small. A rawness, a loss of the authoritative certainty that had always been his default register. We didn't know how to call you. I picked up the phone 100 times. Your mother... I called, my mom said quietly. I drove to your apartment once. I sat outside in the car for 45 minutes. I stared at her. And I left. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I was ashamed. I didn't know how to... She shook her head. There's no excuse, Mara. I know that. I know. The silence in that room was different from the silence in our parents' kitchen 7 years ago. That silence had been cold and declarative, a door slamming. This one was warm with grief, with all the specific weight of things that had not been said and now needed to be, even if no one quite knew where to begin. You chose her, I said. Not angrily. I had moved past anger the way you move past a neighborhood you used to live in. You recognize it, but it's no longer yours. I stood there and told you the truth, and you chose her without a second thought. We know, my dad said. I want you to understand what that cost me. Not financially. I built my business. I'm fine. I don't need you to feel sorry about that. But I spent 5 years not having parents. I spent 5 years watching other people's families from a distance. I missed things. I missed... My voice, steady until that moment, wavered slightly. I collected it. I missed things I can't get back. I know, my mom said again, and the way she said it, the depth of it, told me she had spent considerable time sitting inside that knowledge. I know, sweetheart. Sweetheart, the word hit me somewhere unguarded. I did not storm out. I did not give a speech. I did not have a moment of dramatic triumph where I listed every way I had been wronged and watched them absorb it. That's not who I am, and more than that, it wouldn't have helped any of us. What I did was stay. I sat in that hospital for 6 hours that day, and I came back the next morning, and the morning after that while Jade prepared for her procedure. I sat with my parents in waiting rooms and we talked, haltingly at first, then more fluidly about the years in between, about what they had missed, about Jade, who, I learned, had spent those same 5 years in her own unraveling, Derek leaving eventually, a job that hadn't worked out, a loneliness she hadn't known how to name.
The procedure went smoothly. Jade came out of it pale and exhausted, and more herself than she'd been in the hospital room. The defenses back up slightly, the humor returning in dry little flickers. When I walked into her recovery room the afternoon after and set a chai from the hospital coffee cart on her bedside table, she'd been obsessed with chai since high school, she looked at it for a long moment. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything," I told her, and I meant it in every direction. She apologized properly the next day. Not dramatically, not with tears or speeches. She waited until our parents had stepped out to get lunch, and then she looked at me and said, "I am so sorry, Mara. I was jealous and I was scared, and I made the worst choice of my life, and then I was too much of a coward to fix it. You didn't deserve any of it, none of it, and I'm sorry." I sat with it, let it land. "Okay," I said finally. "Okay?" She looked uncertain. "I believe you. I forgive you. But Jade," I met her eyes, "forgiveness doesn't mean everything is what it was. We have to build something new. That takes time, and you can't rush it, and I can't manufacture it." She nodded. "I know." A pause. "Can we try?" "Yes, we can try."
My parents and I had our harder conversation over dinner a few weeks after Jade came home, in my parents' kitchen, the same kitchen where it had all fallen apart, which I think was intentional on my mom's part, a geographical act of acknowledgement. She cooked my favorite meal, chicken marsala with roasted potatoes, and we sat at the table where so many family dinners had happened, and my dad said what he needed to say. He said he was sorry. He said that his instinct to protect Jade had overridden his judgment, and that he had let me down in a way that was fundamental, and that he understood if trust was something we had to rebuild slowly and might never be entirely what it had been. He said it without his usual certainty, without the authoritative register. He said it like a man who had lived inside the weight of a mistake for 5 years and was finally setting it down. My mom talked about the favoritism. She used that word herself, favoritism, without me having to name it first, which took something from her that I could see, a long-held admission finally spoken. She said she hadn't seen it clearly while it was happening, and that she understood that was its own kind of failure. I listened, I asked questions, I didn't perform forgiveness for their comfort, but I also didn't withhold it to punish them. The truth is this, I had done the work already. The forgiveness had happened largely in Dr. Park's office, over years, in the private interior work that nobody witnesses and nobody applauds. What my family needed from me now was not the big dramatic moment of absolution, but the quieter, harder commitment to show up and keep trying, to answer the phone when they called, to let time do the thing only time can do. I drove home that night through streets I used to know by heart, past the coffee shop where I'd worked in college, past the highway exit I'd taken 1,000 times as a child, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't been expecting. Not closure. I think closure is mostly a myth we tell ourselves about things that will always have a little ache in them, but something like integration, the sense of being whole in a way that includes the broken parts rather than replacing them. I have thought often about what Jade was afraid of. Not to excuse her, what she did was a serious, conscious choice, the kind that alters lives, but I understand in the way that only someone who grew up in the same house can understand, what it felt like to always be measuring yourself against a sibling, to feel like there was only so much attention, so much pride, so much room, and that someone else was always taking up the portion you needed. That fear doesn't justify what she did, but it makes her human. It makes her someone I can understand, even while holding her accountable. And my parents, they are people who learn to love us in ways that were shaped by their own parents, their own fears, their own definitions of protection. They did real harm, and they are people who spent 5 years carrying the knowledge of that harm without the courage to make it right. I don't think they are bad people. I think they were people who were weak in a moment that required strength, and who paid for it quietly for years before anyone gave them the chance to say so out loud.
This is not a story about how everything is fixed now. Jade and I are rebuilding something, slowly, through text messages and phone calls and one lunch that went 2 hours longer than either of us planned. My parents and I have dinner once a month, and some of those dinners are warm, and some of them are stilted, and all of them are better than the silence was. The trust is a thing under construction rather than a thing restored. I think that distinction matters because restoration implies going back to what it was, and what it was contained the conditions for what happened. We are building something new with better architecture. What I know for certain is this: I did not need to be rescued. I built my life without them, and I am proud of that life in a way that has nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. The business is mine. The friendships are mine. The woman I became in those 5 years is mine, forged without the safety net of family, without the softness of belonging to something given rather than chosen. I did not help Jade because I owed it to her. I did not return to that hospital out of obligation, or out of weakness, or out of some defeated surrender to the past. I went because I chose to, because I had enough security, enough self-worth, enough of the life I'd built that I could afford to choose grace without it costing me myself. That is the thing I want you to hear if you're listening and you recognize something of your story in mine. Grace given from scarcity costs you something you can't get back. Grace given from fullness costs you almost nothing, and it changes the whole room. I am not the girl who drove away from that engagement party with shaking hands and silent tears. I am not the woman who sat on a bathroom floor in the dark at 2 a.m. waiting for a phone to ring. I am someone who was made by all of that, who carries it, but who is no longer defined by it. The people who break you, if you let them, if you do the hard interior work of not letting the breaking be the last word, become the people who teach you what you're actually made of. My sister lied, and my parents believed her, and I lost 5 years of my family. I also found myself. I found out what I could survive, what I could build, what I was worth when no one who was supposed to love me unconditionally was watching. That knowledge belongs to me. No one can take it back. And on most days, if I'm honest, I wouldn't trade it. Not even for the years I lost. Well, maybe on some days I would, but not today. If you like this story of mine, please leave a nice comment and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you.